Hello, one and all. My name is Jordan Leroy Hansen, also known as Ledev, and we're going to have an interesting episode of Top Deck Fox because, oh boy, am I surprised. This came out of nowhere. Everybody was surprised by this announcement, but Monday morning, this morning, like when I was just at work and I saw it through my Twitter feed, I'm not going to lie, when I saw the initial banning post, I thought it was a joke post. I thought it was just Carrie just doing his joke post. But when I figured out that it was actually legit real, the new BNR announcement, I was legit excited. Now, it's affecting a lot of formats, like it fits Standard, Pioneer, and also Historic and Brawl. We're not going to talk a bit about the Pioneer bans because I am not that well experienced in Pioneer, so I don't feel like I can talk about it with due knowledge, so to speak. But I will talk about the Standard ban specifically, since that's kind of what this content creation channel does work on. And some big cards were banned in Standard through Magic the Gathering. Some of the really obnoxious cards that were in the meta, the ones that we've been talking about that needed to get the ban hammer, had finally got banned. Like, let's just go through the list, shall we? Okay, the one that's most people were kind of question marking on was Cauldron Familiar. And as a person who played the Jund Sack deck, I kind of am a little sad that this one got banned. But on the other hand, I kind of understand why they banned this card. They had to ban something from Jund Sack or Rakdos Sack because the archetype was very powerful. So they did have to nerf the power a little bit, especially with regarding to the other bans. And I feel like this was the, how would I phrase it, probably the best target, especially since I know many people were reading Watsy's article on it, which you could read the new banner restricted article. I'll provide a link in the captions down below. Essentially, their reasoning for the Cauldron Familiar ban was just the triggers were too much and they thought it was obnoxious for players on the digital format. More or less was pretty much how they phrased it, or it was more problematic to the client. Though, translation, it's probably because people were tired of the constant, the combo. Just essentially bring back cat, sack food, and then, sack the cat, get food, etc., etc., etc. So I think they were just wanting to get that little combo nipped in the butt, so to speak, so that it was just not really annoying on the arena client, which, for a new player experience, I think that is fair. I know many people had talked about the factor that maybe it should have more or less give us an F6 option or an option to auto-geared on these commands. I agree with that, but I do think it's something that they have to develop a little bit more and such. But still, I am grateful that something in the sacrifice decks have been nipped, even though the cat is kind of sad to see gone, for lack of a better word. Now, let's talk about some of the big ones. Growth Spiral. Now, I'm going to say this. I love the Growth Spiral art. I love Seb McKinnon art. I literally have a playmat of it right next here on my desk. But boy, the fact that they decided to nip on Growth Spiral was probably a good idea. Now, the reason why Growth Spiral was such a problematic card was not really the factor that the card itself is perfectly fine, for lack of better words. The problem is just we had so many payoffs with Growth Spiral that usually the typical ways that you would usually do ramp, where it's like you ramp up to a really, really big fiend, was not really ramp at the moment. Simic ramp was not the usual Simic ramp in the past, where you ramp up to a ridiculously big payoff. Due to the factor of one other card we're going to get to, it was really hard to play that type of archetype. Though the problem is, with Growth Spiral, it enabled another archetype where the ramping into kind of like little pay engines. Like you use this to ramp into either a turn 4 Planeswalker that gives you general value, or you ramp and then ramp into Nissa, which, honestly, I am still surprised Nissa, who shades the world, didn't got the ban hammer, but we'll talk about that in a minute. I think Growth Spiral was something that, it's sad that it got banned, but I think it's understandable because it will keep ramp at least in check for the at least next 2 months until Zendikar Rising comes out. It is a sad ban. I'm a little sad that it got banned, but on the other side of the coin, it was a really annoying card. It was enabling ramp too much, so I do think it was a nice check. And yes, we still have Uro in the format, but I think Uro, the factor that it's a more fat a creature spell rather than an instant spell, I think it's going to be a lot more answered compared to Growth Spiral. I think pretty much that's what's going to happen. Uro has a lot of answers to it. They have stuff like Scavenging Ooze, a lot of Graveyard Hate, so I feel like Uro is going to be kept in check, while Growth Spiral, you really couldn't keep it in check since people can always constantly cast it on turn 2, or even in some circumstances, like in older well, no, you can only cast on turn 2. I was almost about to make a joke that you could cast on turn 1, but I don't think you can do that. So, Growth Spiral, it's sad, but it's understandable. Now, the one that everybody was kind of hallelujah of, and even I admit it's hallelujah, Teferi Time Reveler finally got banned. Thank you. I don't know how many thank yous I can express, but boy, this card needed banned. And as you can see, it's getting banned in multiple formats. It got banned in Standard, Historic, Traditional, Historic, and even banned in Brawl. It turns out, it's one of those things, I still remember when this card got initially spoiled when War of the Spark came out, and I kind of thought, oh, will be kind of a cool card, because it will help counter control decks. That's actually kind of nice, and this was at the time where control was kind of obnoxious. And now I kind of, thanks to Teferi Time Reveler being in the meta for way too long, I'm starting to realize that we really do need control magic, because, oh boy, when you negate instant and sorcery spells, which is the primary reason why Teferi was played, Magic becomes a lot more stagnant, and it becomes more like you have to go into more of a early game value engine, or early game aggro, or just go onto a specific combo plan, because if you're not, then you really couldn't be able to do mid-range strategies or do any instant spell strategies. You can't do the mid-range strategies because Teferi Time Reveler bounces your creature, which then makes you waste mana, which then makes you lose tempo, which is really, really bad. So it made a majority of creatures that were between the 3 and pretty much higher mana costs literally unplayable because you had to consider the fact, oh wait, Teferi can bounce my creature. Blech. And then also there's a lot of really good instant sorcery spells now in the meta that's now playable due to the fact that we don't have to worry about Teferi's taxing effect. And also, the other thing that I think many people will forget that's actually very powerful that with this ban, finally, Sorcery Speed Magic is Sorcery Speed Magic. Because I think we all have seen the times where this card had made a Fodder Erasure or just a Shadow of the Sky instant speed at the beginning of our turn or beginning of our combat, and realized how obnoxious that was. So, yeah, this is the card that will affect the meta a lot. The factor that now we can play more mid-range creatures and more instant and sorcery spells will impact the meta a ton. Like, we're going to get into tips real quick once we talk about the last ban, but I am so grateful Teferi's gone, you have no idea. But I will admit one thing, and it's with the last ban and this combo with this, Wilderness Reclamation. Wilderness Reclamation was kind of one of those cards that I'm going to admit I was the original person that when I saw Teferi, I was kind of like on the fence of still being a Captain Standard because I was like, you know, it keeps Wilderness Reclamation in check. It also keeps like Flash in check, which we'll talk about that once we talk about meta tips on how to do the new meta. But yeah, Wilderness Reclamation, I'm kind of grateful this card's gone, to be honest, because this is a card where thanks to stuff like Growth Spiral and Uro and a lot of ramp, people really got this out too early. And the fact that people got this out too early made playing against this card so obnoxious. You have no idea. I mean, the fact that it stacks, I think, is the killing thing that made this card obnoxious, because we all seen the popularity and how competitively viable this card is, especially with the tournaments that happened this last weekend. This card was ridiculously absurd. And the problem is, you had to pretty much alter your deck to either A, go fast enough to beat before Wilderness Reclamation gets turned online, or B, hope that you decide to have instant speed removal to remove the enchantment, and hope to not play in 4-color Reclamation, which has Teferi in it, which then negates you being able to counter this. Yeah, I was originally in the side that I was like, well, Teferi is the thing that keeps Wilderness Rec in check. I'm going to admit, I was wrong on that. Especially when I saw this weekend that people were playing 4-color Wilderness Wreck just to play Teferi. And I think, actually, I'm going to go back to Teferi one more bit. I think one thing that we kind of realized once we played more against with Teferi throughout this year, or it feels like years almost, jokingly, but, and also playing it in Eternal formats for many people, I think they realized that Teferi does counter control very well, but it really makes combo decks a lot more consistent than they probably should be. Because the factor is, once you counter instant speed, not just control, but removal as well, then combo decks becomes a lot more consistent. I mean, it's saying something when Teferi can sometimes see play in Infect. Let that sink in for a minute. Sometimes Teferi can see play in Infect. But yeah, I digress. So yeah, with Wilderness Wreck, it was way too powerful, enabled a lot of archetypes, doubled mana. If you were not playing this type of deck archetype or a way to fight against this deck archetype, you most likely lose. It's grateful this got banned. So, now we talked about my kind of like overall impressions of these bans. Now the question asks, how do we adapt to the new meta that's coming up thanks to these bans? Well, I'm going to just offer my quick tips and such to finish off this video. First thing, as I said before, thanks to the Teferi ban, we have actually a lot more viability to play instant speed Magic again. So it makes a lot of instant spells that we originally were kind of not really playing as much due to Teferi being a card. It makes them actually a lot more viable now, like especially the Adventurers. Like, one deck that's actually going to be very, very good in this upcoming expansion is probably stuff like Temur Clover. Temur Clover did not really lose anything other than maybe Growth Spiral, since some lists did run that, but let's be frank, you could just replace the Growth Spirals with the Beanstalk Giant and be relatively alright. You can actually now start running adventures again, and you can definitely now do some variety of adventure archetypes. You can do like Golgari Knights again, which is awesome to think that Golgari Knights can actually be a thing again. You can do Temur Clover. And also, just there's a lot of now, the fact that we can play instants again makes us be able to actually play, for the most part, a lot of good tech cards in the sideboard that we weren't originally playing because we're like, well, it doesn't really help against Teferi. Like, for example, you can actually now play Disenchant, which I think it's going to be a lot more relevant to look at instant speed artifact removal, especially with Temur Clover and Embercleave still in the format. So keep an eye on spells that are instant speed that destroy target artifacts and enchantments. You might need them, is what I'm saying. Especially since Embercleave is still in the format, and then Temur Clover will probably follow right after it. So, something to keep in mind. Also, another card that I think will be a lot more better if you play blue in the format, that I think would be either a safe sideboard, but maybe even a safe mainboard, is Miscast now. Because as I stated before, with thanks to the fact that the Temur Clover is going to be a popular archetype, a lot of people are going to, as I stated before, thanks to the Teferi ban, will run a lot more instant spells, and I feel like Miscast will now be a lot more viable to either counter an adventure spell, or be able to counter any pretty much instant and sometimes sorcery spells that people are going to be playing thanks to Teferi ban. So, something to keep in mind. Also, one thing I'm going to stress, keep an eye on all your creatures from mana converted cost 2 to mana cost 5 or higher, because as stated before, there's a lot of cards that when initially reviewed for kind of like standard and such, our initial complaints were, and even, not even just creatures, but even artifacts now coming to think of it, there's even artifacts and enchantments that you have to now keep in mind that could be actually a lot more standard viable due to the fact that technically Teferi is gone. Like, keep in mind, like, when initially people were reviewing, like, Terror of the Peaks, many people were like, oh, this is a very powerful creature, but it gets bounced by Teferi, so it's not really that effective. Well, since Teferi is gone, this is actually a ridiculously scary card in the format. Like, this card can actually be playable. Even stuff like Questing Beasts, or even some free drop creatures that people have been, like, playing with. Like, for example, if we go back a little bit into the Flash archetype, just a teeny bit here, there's a lot of cards that get a lot more playable now. Such as, for example, Ashiok's Erasure becomes something to consider, because hey, Teferi doesn't negate that, and it's going to be probably a really, really powerful counterspell that you might want to keep in mind. Just also stuff like even in the budget options, Capture Spear becomes a lot more viable budget option. Or even, like, let me get to the gold cards real quick. There's stuff like Thief Guild's Enforcer becomes a lot more playable, since you can flash it for Death Touch, more or less. Maybe Illumion Standard Bearer, but granted, I'm still debating whether or not the playability of that card, since I've been trying it. There's stuff like Batra Dark Destroyer, which even that leads to another subject that even I thought of. Thanks to Teferi being banned, Mutate actually becomes a lot more viable now, since you don't have to worry about your creature being bounced. Just, I can't stress enough how much Teferi will affect this format. It's absurd to think about it. Even we can play Niambe now. We can actually play Niambe. We can even play Flash like Lawmaker's Binding as a budget option. Slitherwisp can actually be potentially viable, and we may even finally now see the threat that Lochmere Serpent can actually be, because, yet again, as I stated before, most people were kind of avoiding the 5 to higher cost creatures because of Teferi. But now, with Teferi gone, it makes these cards a lot more viable to play. It's just, I can't stress this enough. And the fact that Wilderness Wreck will help us prevent from doubling mana, ramp is going to be relatively fair in quotation marks. Yes, there's still Erlo. Yes, there's still a lot of mana dorks and Keenan and all that stuff. But you can actually, thanks to the fact that we have now more instant speed removal and also more mid-range creatures that we can play, I think it's going to be kept in check a little bit. Like, for example, we still have stuff like Spark Hunter Manticore, which haven't really seen much play, even though it is one of the weirdest cards to get protection from Teferi, which is ironic. But I think this might actually see a lot more play to help against, like, Nissa archetypes, because it protects those lands pretty easily. It also can just, the mana can be synced in to just keep Nissa in check. I think you want to keep an eye on Spark Hunter Masticore. I think it becomes a lot more playable card, in my personal opinion. Another card that I think might be potentially a lot more playable, though I'm kind of saying maybe in quotation marks in this one. Let's see, I think it was Karavek, I think it's how it's spelled. I always get this name wrong. Let's do this easier. Let's go black, search free cost. Like I said, this is like off the cuff, so you're gonna see some fast scrolling here for a minute. Let's see, it's Oh yeah, and also keep in mind, Murderous Rider, budget option Murder is a lot more playable now, and now Mythos is a lot more playable, so keep that in mind. Also, Necromantia might be a lot more playable now, since combo decks that, like the Nissa, ramp decks, and all that, can actually now be answered a lot more easier with Necromantia, and also Unmoored Ego while it's still legal. Heck, even Frigga's Libation is actually a lot playable now, which is funny to think about. Anyway, what was I thinking? Okay, where is it? It's Karavek. It's a. Oh, I passed it. That explains it. Oh, was it a 4-cost creature? I always think it's free for some random reason. Okay. Yeah, I'm showing a professional here. My bad on this one. Okay, where is it? ABD. There we go. Karavek the Spiteful actually becomes a lot more playable now, because it's also a really good, decent option against aggro. Especially now other creatures get -1/-1, so something to keep in mind, I would say. Like I said, you really just gotta look at all your creatures you have in your collection at the moment between, like, 1 to high, because now those creatures are a lot more playable thanks to Teferi being out of the format. Also keep an eye on instant sorcery spells. I mean, I can't stress enough the factor that I'm so excited to actually play this standard now, which is saying something before, because last few days I was even kind of a little bit salty about the meta, but the fact that these changes happen is just so awesome. Like, I could keep talking, so I think I'm just going to close it out, because I could be talking about brews all day with the fact of this one. But my overall impression, I'm happy with them. Thank you. Yes, there should have been some other cards in consideration, but I think these ones are a good start. And tips I would say for the meta is take a look at creatures that are more late game to mid-range creatures are actually a lot more playable thanks to the Teferi ban, so keep an eye on that. More mid-range, even some ramp options is still viable in the meta because we still have Nissa. Why? I don't understand. But there is a lot of ways to control that specific ramp deck to help play against it, whether it's aggro or just a factor of just basic hand hate and such. So keep that in mind, and just honestly, just have fun. Like, I think this is going to be a lot more fun. Like, I played a little bit on my free time during my lunch break, and seeing so many variety of people trying out different decks, trying out different archetypes that were not possible due to the fact of these problematic cards, it was a breath of fresh air. So, thank you, whoever at WotC's balance team, for giving us these bans. They were a lovely surprise. Nevertheless, I hope you all have a lovely day. This is LevDev, signing out. Adieu.